Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, from today onwards we are starting a very new series, and this series is on inequality and difference. This is the first lecture in this series. So today we are going to talk on historical perspective to inequality in India. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in Department of History, PGTAV Evening College, University of Delhi. Dr. Vip's immense experience always helps us out in understanding various topics in detail, and we believe that through the entire series you are going to grab maximum knowledge through her. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Vip, and let's try to be acquainted with the different areas. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Vip once again. Hello ma'am, welcome to the lecture.
Hello Geetika, thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. The reason this topic has been selected is that it is part of the study course of a number of undergraduate programs, both at the honors level as well as BA program courses, and this paper is taught in a number of universities. So I'm sure this is going to help the students not only prepare for the exams, but also since the topic is very relevant and contemporary, and this also deals with an issue which is not only limited to Indian society but world over. So I'm sure the students are going to benefit a lot. As has been introduced by Geetika, the title of the series is Inequality and Difference. So the very term encompasses the idea that is going to be discussed as part of this series, that is how one comes across differences of various kinds and how these differences are built up over time, not only historically but also in the contemporary times, and how ultimately this leads to inequality, because the goal of not only our constitution but also UN is to bridge the differences, is to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor. So therefore, it is very imperative for us as students and as teachers, as academicians, to know about the various processes and the theorization that goes behind various kinds of inequalities. So with this idea, I plan to introduce this series today, and the first lecture would primarily focus on theorization as well as the historical perspective. So beginning the lecture, let me first give you a brief outline of the lecture as to how different lectures would be planned. So in this, I would be talking about how various kinds of inequalities, whether it was caste, class, community-based, or religion-based inequalities and differences, emerged over a period of time. So there would be some kind of periodization that would be considered. For example, it would be pre-British India, that would not only include ancient times, because many of our social categories like caste, class, varna, especially caste and varna and jati, they originated during the ancient times. And after that, we would be coming to the medieval, the Mughal period, and then after that, of course, the British India, the colonial period, and then gradually giving way to the post-colonial times, where I would be discussing in detail as to how the constitution makers, they promulgated a number of laws, and the idea was to create a more holistic and a more equal and a classless, casteless society. And then gradually globalization onwards, the changing trends, what all positive and negative changes have come about, they would be discussed in greater detail. Now, having introduced you to the basic periodization that I would be focusing on, the next level of discussion would revolve around the idea of stratification. So the definition of social stratification, the theorization that goes with it, and then also the concept of social structure and inequality would be discussed in greater detail. As we move from one period to another, I would also be kind of attempting some kind of a comparison, not only with the past but also with the changing contemporary times. Now, as has already been discussed by me in greater detail when we were doing the gender series, we have already discussed how the whole idea of patriarchy and the institution of patriarchy emerged during ancient Indian period of history, and then how it gradually got strengthened. So in addition to patriarchy, which is specifically related to gender but also caste, even the caste hierarchies, the jatis and the varnas, they kind of matured and they kind of fully established themselves, and the jati as the very divisive and a binding force of Indian society, it fully established itself during the ancient period. But since I have planned a separate series on caste, varna and jati, a separate lecture on caste, varna and jati. So right now I would be just introducing you to the concept of caste or varna as a divisive force and how it leads to inequality and difference. And the next category that we would be discussing is the category of class, where we would be talking about unequal distribution of wealth and also power, which leads to different categorizations of classes as they have existed in the past and continue to exist. And in fact, this social stratification is further establishing itself fully. And then we would be talking about the medieval period. In this, a very important observation that has been made for the Mughal period, the Mughal times, is the great Mughal consumes everything. Now, this basically demarcates the idea. It basically is to convey the idea that during the Mughal period, an economy which was based on the extraction of vast resources from the countryside to the center for redistribution down to the chain of military and civilian officials of the regime, and each had its own retinue of retainers, its own retinue of supporters to be supported. So therefore, the very idea of revenue appropriation was primarily geared to meet the military demands of the state, to meet the fiscal demands of the state, and whatever was being collected was hardly for redistribution among the poor or for the welfare of the subjects. The Mughal Empire was an unsatiable Leviathan defined by its unlimited appetite for resources, a statement that has been made by Tapan Ray Chaudhary, which basically sums up that how the core idea behind the functionality of the Mughal state was appropriation of as much resources as could be, which is also explained from very high rate of revenue appropriation that was prevalent during this period. So while on the one hand, the burden of appropriation was being felt by the peasantry, by the agricultural laborers, on the other hand, economy was also thriving because commerce was being promoted, means of communication and transportation were being encouraged, more and more sarais and such initiatives were being undertaken, roads were being properly taken care of, so as to promote trade and commerce and to enhance the standard of royal treasury. Also, what was being promoted was the payment of land tax in cash, and also an attempt to lower the taxation of cash crops, so that more and more peasants preferred growing cash crops and commercial crops instead of food crops or subsistence agriculture. So on the whole, the system that emerged was the system of inequalities, where the royalty and its retinue and the royal household was at a much higher level, and in fact no commoner could even aspire or dream of reaching to that level, because the cycle of appropriation was such that very few resources were left at the disposal of the cultivators and the poorer sections of society, that they could hardly meet their basic requirements. So to think or to talk in terms of luxury or luxurious lifestyle was beyond their scope of thinking. Now coming to the British India, the period from 1757 onwards, after Battle of Plassey, when East India Company was able to establish its foothold over Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and then of course the Battle of Buxar 1764, which again gave them an opportunity to further strengthen their grip over much of North India, gradually being followed by the subsidiary alliance system and then the expansionist policy of Lord Dalhousie. All this opened way for Britishers to establish themselves politically and militarily in India. And the kind of colonial regime that they established clearly was rooted in the principles of exploitation, and the inequality was bound to increase after the establishment of the colonial rule. So basically one can talk about two counteracting forces for the colonial period. One was the factor of deindustrialization, which led to basically wage stagnation and a steep rise in rural poverty. And on the other hand, with the rise of commerce, the size of the middle income groups increased. This basically one can include various categories like lower level officials, commercial elites, bankers, money lenders, middle to rich peasants, etc. So therefore both these processes were going hand in hand. On the one hand, there was ruralization of the economy, there was an overthrow of traditional handicrafts and industries and creation of joblessness in the countryside, because a large number of labor force used to engage both in agricultural activities as well as in production activities during the lean season, when there were no agricultural activities that were going on in the countryside. Probably they would be pitching in as part of the family workforce in the weaving industry or in the spinning industry and other such activities. But once the Manchester produced cloth started filling Indian homes, and there was a deliberate policy of encouraging British manufactured goods, there was no respite for the poor weavers of India. So gradually industrialization or handloom industrialization gave way to deindustrialization, and this not only created a class and a category of jobless and landless agricultural laborers, but also weavers and spinners. They just lost their jobs and they had nothing else to do but to become vagabonds and to start leading a life of penury. So therefore, the whole idea, the whole issue and the problem of inequality got further a boost during the colonial period. And the other process that I just mentioned was that of colonial administration and some kind of commerce that was being promoted in order to benefit English industries and in order to provide a smoother functioning for colonial administration. And there was specific class and category of a special section of Indian society which was going to benefit out of these changes. And in this one can talk about the emerging middle class, the Bhadralok, who completely appropriated the kind of new opportunities that were coming their way, and with their mastery over English language, English education, and their appropriation of schools and colleges, which were basically not within the reach of the poorer sections of society, the divide between the haves and have-nots, those who could still think of coming to power even in the colonial regime, and those who had even lost their basic freedom to earn a livelihood for themselves, became all the more clear. This was the whole situation was unlike Mughal India, where a few hundred families of mansabdars, that is the military rank, had access to 1/3 of the gross produce of the land. So therefore, the kind of inequality which was prevalent in Mughal period, though continued with a different emphasis during the British period, because now the appropriator was no longer one of their own. It was a foreign power, and it was completely, whatever was being generated was completely going out of the country through drain of wealth. And this further created condition of poverty, and this was all the more a reason behind the rising tide of inequality. Now, having discussed in passing reference what happened during the the colonial period, now the next important period that one can discuss, and this can be taken up as a separate field of discussion also, would be the post-independence India, and how the state promulgated a number of schemes, policies, programs. They were initiated from time to time, and from 1950 onwards, there was no looking back as far as the agenda of equity was concerned. So that has to be taken care of by the students. This not only means a detailed understanding of the 5-year planning periods and how these planning periods were kind of shifting the focus from agriculture to industry and to other growth related strategies. After going through this planning period in detail, the next important benchmark would be the globalization, that is the changes that came about in Indian economy post 1990s, and it would be very interesting to understand as to how these changes which came about post 1990s also had greater ramifications for society. So a very valid question that arises here is that did inequality and difference take a backseat after 1990s, or the story was completely different, and inequality and social stratification rather increased in the society. So all these themes will be taken up by me in different lectures, and probably today's lecture is more of an introductory nature, where I am introducing you to the basic concepts. So going back to the issue of globalization and how it impacted the issue of inequality and difference, the first period of globalization, of course, cannot be described as post 1990s, because the first period of globalization can also be described as the period of colonization, and particularly this is very relevant for India, because India was almost for 190 years, it was under the colonial regime. So that probably was the first period of globalization, and from 1780 to 1914 there was one set of policies that was being followed, where the overall emphasis was not on encouraging any kind of economic development activity in India, because it was considered that India could fairly play the role of provider of cheap raw materials and a consumer of British manufactured goods. But gradually there had to be a change in this policy, because after 1914, with the emergence of the First World War, with the starting of the First World War, there were many difficulties, logistical difficulties, and everything could not be procured from Britain. So therefore, the colonial regime in India was forced to encourage some kind of economic activities, some kind of heavy industrialization had to be started, jute industry had to be given a push, and some basic industries had to be shown green flag, because everything could not be procured from outside due to disruption of trade routes due to disruption of sea routes. And during the interwar period, so during the First World War and during the Second World War, this is known as the interwar period, there was some kind of economic, some kind of industrialization that was allowed to begin, and many Indian industrialists also took initiative, and a number of nationalist industries were started during this period. However, the ratio of trade to income increased from 1 to 2% in 1800 to 20% in 1914 for India. So therefore, though there was some progress, but it was very slow, and India's share was still only 20%, and the international flow of capital was also higher than the pre or the post-colonial period during the globalization period. Trade, however, collapsed during the interwar period, as I just said, due to disruption of trade routes and due to disruption of waterways. And after independence, India disengaged temporarily with the world economy to an inward looking economy, because of course the focus was on first setting the house in order, because it was not only independence that had been achieved in 1947, it was also partition. So independence had come with the wound of partition, and it needed a lot of time, resources, money to heal that wound, and a lot of money was going into rehabilitation activities, which was kind of an emergency for the state. So therefore, it took a lot of time to stabilize, to get things on the right track, and immediately after independence, the state could not start thinking of bridging the gap between the rich and the poor. The second period of globalization that can be traced to the period from 1985 onwards, or from 1990s onwards in case of India, is marked by the trade liberalization regime, the neoliberal policies, and an investment regime in which the open door policy was to be followed. The doors of economy had to be opened for the foreign investors, and they were being encouraged, the countries were being encouraged to come and invest in India for profit motive. And all this further resulted in widening the gap between the rich and the poor, because the level of exploitation increased manyfold after 1990s, because very few regulatory practices were in order, and this was one of the precondition, in fact, to loosen the grip, to loosen the tight grip. And once this tight grip was loosened by the government, there was no looking back as far as exploitation of the poor, exploitation of the labor, and declining trade unionism was concerned. So therefore, instead of bridging the gap, or instead of reallocation of resources, keeping in mind the principles of equity, rather the reverse started happening from post 1990s, with the very nature of jobs changing. So now the nature of job was hardly permanent job, because permanent job comes with perks, it comes with so many benefits, subsidies, allowances, pensions. But post 1990s has been a trend of temporary ad hoc kind of jobs or contractual employment, where the very existence of the labor force is at risk, and they can be removed from their jobs within no time, and they have hardly any claims over their employers. So with these kind of changes coming about after 1985 in the world economy and in India as well, there was bound to be more inequality and more difference between the rich and the poor. Now, coming to the issue of social structure and inequality in India, it is very important to make it very clear at the onset that inequality is not only about income inequality or difference between the rich and the poor. It has a much wider appeal, and it has a much wider connotation, because this also means inequality in terms of social structure. It also means divisive society. It also means how different standards or different morals and different values and different statuses are assigned to particular categories of people or community. So therefore, our next discussion would be hinging on this idea of social structure and inequality. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. And friends, we believe that you might be wondering for lots and lots of information. So be with us as we are back after a short break. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on historical perspective to inequality in India. In our previous session we discussed a lot, and in this session too, as promised, here we are going to specifically talk on social stratification and inequality. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Webb. Dr. Shruti Webb is an eminent professor. Through her we always gather maximum knowledge. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Webb once again, and let's carry forward the lecture. Hello ma'am, welcome back to the session.
Hello Geetika, thanks a lot for this opportunity. So friends, we were discussing the issue of social stratification and how it is not only class which is an important category to understand the problem of inequality and difference, because particularly in a society like India, the idea of caste and jati is very important, and this is a very important way of creating social stratification in society. So carrying our discussion further on the issue of social structure and social stratification, the most important theme that one has to talk about when one is talking about social stratification is the caste system, the jati and the varna system. So basically the caste system can be described as a system of elaborately stratified social hierarchy, which is implied in a hereditary sense, and also it prescribed earlier to occupations. So basically the occupational identification was a one way of understanding jati or the caste of a person. This was largely promoted by the Jajmani system or the patron-client system that had established itself in India over a period of time. So when I am talking about Jajmani system, which is basically a hereditary system of patron-client relationships between the Jajman. Jajman was the patron, the one who patronized those who were working under him. And these Jajmans were usually landed proprietors, and they usually were from the upper and middle castes, whereas the clients or the balutedars, they belonged to the lower categories, and they were mostly unfree agricultural laborers from the low castes who were expected to provide free labor and other specialized services to men of upper castes and the middle castes. So basically this Jajmani system or the patron-client system had primarily been promoted as a way of maintaining social stratification within the society, so that the rich and the poor, they stand at the two extreme ends of the society, and the poor continue to serve the rich with a legalized system which was the Jajmani system. And also over a period of time there emerged significant endogamy within the castes and religions. Endogamy, as you all know, is basically you are marrying within your own group, within your own social group, and not outside that. So there is no exogamy, but there is endogamy in order to promote the system of caste purity. And also a number of radical affirmative actions were taken after independence, and a significant mobilization, particularly among the SCs and also to some extent among STs, has resulted in some kind of empowerment of the Dalits, which basically means SCs since the 1980s. So this also would become a part of our discussion when we would be taking a detailed understanding and study of the caste system and the jati system as an important mode of social stratification. Now, when we are talking about the contemporary times and when we are trying to understand the situation of inequality as it exists in today's India, there are certain themes that emerge. One most important theme that emerges is that the levels of inequality are still exceptionally high. So therefore, even after so many decades of independence, and even after so many legal actions having been taken and constitutional provisions having existed, the problem of inequality continues to exist, and in fact it is at an exceptionally high and an alarming level. Then another theme that emerges is high inequality causes economic and social hardships. This not only creates lawlessness, but it also creates frustration. It also creates a feeling of injustice, which is again not very healthy feeling to live with. Then thirdly, social policies can combat inequalities. So here the statement that is being made is social policies. So it is not always a legal change, or it is not always the law which is responsible for bringing about a change, or even if it exists, the legal entitlements exist, unless and until the social framework of society is changed, the mindset, the attitudes are changing, and the cultural idioms are changing. The change will not come only through changing laws or with the law on the side of the poorer and the marginalized sections of society. So what we need today is a change in mindset, a change in the attitudes to deal with the problem of social stratification. So therefore, the need of the hour is social policy as much as political policies or economic policies. So this socio-cultural change, how it will come about? Here a very important role can be played by the community, by the local community, by the NGOs, and by the other such empowered and enlightened sections of society. They can be the change makers, and of course the role of family, school and educational institutions continues to be important. But again, when we are talking about family, there is a lot of difference between the way a rich or a middle class family can take a stand and the way a poor or a marginalized family can take a stand. So therefore the initiative has to come from all the levels of society, all the sections of society, to bridge this gap. Then of course we need much more detailed research and also some practical initiatives and programs to identify defects in the current policies. So basically there is a need to point out the anomalies, the weaknesses that exist in the current policies, so that the new programs and policies can be introduced with the initiative of not only the state but also, as I said, the community. The larger community must play an important role in order to introduce the changes with a practical approach. Then another important theme that emerges during the course of the discussion is conjectures on future path of inequality in India. So we cannot only keep discussing what happened in the past, or we cannot only focus our energies to the present. What we need is some kind of futuristic planning, so that the kind of gaps that existed or are still existing can be bridged in a more practical way through this futuristic planning. So therefore future has to be mapped in such a way that correct kind of policies, the practical implications, can be introduced right away. So therefore one has to take into consideration that there has been a very slow increase in inequality of outcomes, as some regions take advantage over others. And this again can be linked to the process of development and globalization. So for example, states like Haryana, they stand at a much higher pedestal than many other important states of India, and the per capita income also varies greatly as far as different states are concerned, because the impact of development policies, impact of globalization has been felt differently over different areas. So this is called regional inequality or regional imbalances, which have to be taken care of. Then another problem that arises when one talks about futuristic projection is that how the issue of inequality of opportunity should be tackled. Now inequality of opportunity may decrease, but again very slowly, due to persistence of endogamy, weak provision of education to the disadvantaged sections of society, and also as economic change allows socially disadvantaged castes to move out of their caste determined occupations, which are basically agricultural occupations or some menial occupations in rural areas. As India urbanizes, this also is a major force that is working behind the whole idea of changing norms of social stratification. So one has to deal with the issue of out-migration and how this out-migrating labor force has to be accommodated in the urban areas, so that they do not replicate the model of ghettoization. They do not replicate the model of, leading miserable lives, while earlier they were doing so in rural areas, but now due to out-migration and due to declining availability of jobs in the rural areas, due to declining importance of agricultural activities in the rural areas, they are out migrating in the urban areas, but without proper civic amenities, without proper resources at their disposal. So some kind of futuristic planning has to take into account all these changes that have been shaping up after 1990s. Now India's economic structure structure has changed dramatically over past 5 to 6 decades, and among these changes are not only specific to India, but they are also being faced by a number of other developing countries also. Benefits of growth, however, are not widely spread to various sections of society, and they have reached only marginally to the low income groups. Now, this also is a reality which various economists have pointed out from time to time, that how increasing industrialization, globalization and development activities, they should naturally benefit all sections of society. In fact, they should benefit the lower sections of society more. But the reality is something else, because the poorer sections are losing their resources, their land, etc. to the multinational corporations, who are gradually acquiring their means of livelihood without sufficiently compensating them. So therefore, at the most, one generation is able to survive with the kind of packages that are offered to them in order to acquire their land. But then the very source of generating livelihood for future generations goes away, and without properly empowering them, without properly appropriating resources for them and creating some kind of guarantee, economic guarantee to them, nothing will change. In fact, after 1 or 2 generations, these families are ultimately going to become poorer and much poorer than they were earlier. So similar experience has also been shared by various other countries. Now, a question that arises here is that, can we guarantee to all at least a minimum level which is necessary for their existence in terms of physical and social development of a person? And this also means some kind of educational guarantee scheme that should be in place, and some kind of employment guarantee scheme that must be in place in order to do away with the menace of social stratification, because caste and class both go hand in hand. And unless and until some kind of class security, some kind of financial independence is provided to the poorer castes and communities, their very survival is at risk. So coming back to the issue of social stratification, this basically can be defined as a systematic inequality between different groups of people. So these different groups of people can be identified on the basis of caste, community, language, region, class, etc. So basically, whenever there is a systematic inequality in the ownership of resources, one can say that there is stratification. Also, there is unequal distribution of wealth, income, prestige, power, knowledge and other such resources, which can also include land, labor, property, etc. So now all these are structured inequalities which are built into systems. So therefore, they appear as normal. They appear as having existed since time immemorial, and they appear as something internal to the very existence of society. As a result, the poorer sections also start accepting their state of affairs as something normal, as something given, and as something about which nothing can be done. Now, on what dimensions does stratification exist? This is also a very important and valid query. There are a number of dimensions which decide stratification, which decide that there would be divisions in the society, in a country. For example, assets. One can talk about, if one talks about the class parameter, then the class parameter would include assets like land, property, wealth, ornaments, money, shares, etc. Then if one talks about the status parameter, because status also generates stratification in society, then one can talk about power, one can talk about prestige, one can talk about status. Then if one talks about the socio-economic status parameter, here the important divisive forces can be education, it can be employment and also income. So the kind of education, the level of education a person gets ultimately decides his or her performance in the job hierarchy, his or her income, and therefore it becomes a very important yardstick to measure how socio-economically empowered or disempowered he or she is. And then the power view, the power factor is of course very important, and this includes the stratification on the basis of power and influence. So basically, till the time there is a ruling class, till the time there are rulers and ruled, this dichotomy, this existence of stratification in society is going to continue. And this we have seen how even in a democratic country, power corrupts, and supreme power corrupts all the more, ultimate power corrupts all the more, and therefore what one needs is a check on this power, and how the balance that needs to be maintained between the powerful and the powerless is a very important aspect. Now coming to the interpretations of stratification, this basically means that how stratification has been theorized and how different ideas have been generated from time to time in order to understand the issue of stratification. One theory that one can talk about is the functionalist approach, which basically talks about the idea of meritocracy. That is, as meritorious a person is, as hardworking and as accomplished and as trained or untrained a person is, accordingly his or her position in the society would be made. So therefore, this approach does not really talk about caste or class issues. It talks about the merits of a person, how much qualified a person is, and what all a person is worthy of, decides his or her hierarchy in the social structure. Then the next important theorization comes from the Marx, that is basically the theory of social conflict. That is the conflict between the haves and the have-nots, and according to Marxist ideology, this class struggle ultimately would or ideally should result in a classless society where the have-nots are able to appropriate the resources in such a way that no one has access to private property. And then Max Weber, who has basically talked about the issue of power, the issue of status, and how stratification can be explained in those terms. So it is wealth, it is power, and it is prestige according to Max Weber, which are the deciding factors which play a very important role in understanding the concept of social stratification. So according to Weber, it is the overall socio-economic status which needs to be understood with a much wider perspective, and an individual's comparative status in society is based on various factors, as I just said, factors like education, factors like training, factors like employment and occupation. So once these differences continue to exist, even if there is a state strategy to bring about an end to social stratification, it can be of no use, because unless and until all the citizens are given some kind of basic education, they are empowered in some kind of ways that they can get some kind of gainful employment, things cannot change, because there always will remain differences between an illiterate and a highly literate and educated and a trained professional. So of course one cannot think of bridging the gap between these unemployed and employed youth unless and until the educational levels and the occupational provisions for the unemployed are also taken care of by the state. So therefore, Max Weber's theorization is a far more holistic way of understanding the idea of social stratification and how things can be changed. Now, coming to the whole dimension of stratification and how these theories that I have just introduced to you have further been explained. The issue of social stratification basically revolves around ranking of people or groups according to their unequal access to the resources, according to unequal access to educational levels, and according to their access to occupations. So the most important resources, which means are the deciding factors behind social stratification, are wealth, income, power and prestige, and Weber emphasized the prestige and power aspects of stratification to be far more valid aspects than merely class aspects, which means and a control over the economic resources is not the only way to promote social stratification or to curtail social stratification. Then coming to the issue of social class, it basically means a segment of the population whose members hold similar amounts of scarce resources and share values, norms and an identifiable lifestyle. So this again, while it from the outside it appears to be more of a homogeneous unit, but when you look closely there is lot of heterogeneity and there is lot of differentiation that is involved in the whole issue of social class also, because even within a social class there are bound to be some members within a community or a caste who are going to be at a better hierarchy, who are going to benefit out of the jobs, who are going to benefit out of the educational opportunities, the various schemes that are there, or the various reservation options that are there. But then within that same social class there would be some who would not really be making use of all these provisions, and they would continue to remain socially stratified in particular ways. Then Marx also explained the importance of the economic foundations of social classes. So according to Marx, the economic foundations of social classes could never be done away with as unimportant, because only through prestige and power there was no way that the differences could be bridged, because it was ultimately your standard, your lifestyle and your control over the resources which was going to decide how you are living your life, how you are leading your lives, and how the differences continue to or they remain absent in the society. Now carrying forward our discussion on the economic dimension, Marx originally identified multiple social classes. So basically the different social classes that he spoke of were the laborers, the servants, the factory workers, the craftspeople, proprietors of small businesses and the moneyed capitalists. So basically it was the capitalists and the proletariats, the two categories that Marx talked about. And on the one hand there was bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie was the class that owned the means of production. So they were probably the owners of the means of production, owners of factories, etc. And on the other hand, the proletariats or the workers belonged to a class that labors without owning the means of production. So basically they had no control over the means of production. They were only contributing through their labor, and their labor was the only asset that they had. But in a capitalist society, even that asset of their labor was cleverly appropriated through various exploitative tendencies by the bourgeoisie. So this dichotomy between bourgeoisie and proletariats was explained by Marx in dialectical terms and in terms of class conflict, that how these two categories are always conflicting, and in fact there can be no reconciliation, because one class existence is based on the appropriation of resources of the other class. So therefore, unless and until this element of exploitation and this element of unequal control over resources is done away with, the class struggle is bound to happen, and in fact it should happen in order to create a classless society. Now coming to the issue of income, income was the amount of money that was received by an individual or a group over a specific period of time. This again, according to Marx, was a major a yardstick of judging how socially stratified a society or economy was. And then wealth, which can be described as the total economic resources that are owned by a person. This not only includes property but also a different kind of economic assets, ornaments, bonds, debentures, all kind of investments that a person has. So definitely there exists a great divide between the income, wealth and resources of the rich and the poor, and hence the continuation of economic inequality, which ultimately procreates, which ultimately strengthens social inequality, and which ultimately gets translated into differences in the society. So, having discussed these various aspects, I shall now be taking a break, and in the next lecture, we would be discussing in detail the aspect of economic dimension with greater insights. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us this session where we discussed a lot. And friends, we believe that you might have lots of questions to be answered. Do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Here you can give your feedbacks too. Your questions are welcome, and we'll try to give answers to your questions when next time Dr. Shruti visits our studio. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Vidya.